Hey, good morning to you, or afternoon, wherever you might reside. This is exciting. We might start this off with a real bang. Everybody always says that, but one of our guests, Angela, literally there's the demolition going on around her building, and she's gotten the horn warning. So I'm really hoping we start this thing with a bang, Angela. Thanks for bringing that to the table.
My pleasure.
For anyone that's had construction, it sounded like Steve has had construction happening before as well. He's used to it. So we're waiting for the big bang. Anyway, I'm Clint with T360. I'll have Kenya also here with T360, and then joined by Angela Shields and Steve Stevens, who are from Kentucky and Tennessee, respectively. Going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion today. And so thanks everybody for tuning in. I wanted to kind of start with more of a generalized question, because we're learning, with issues around DEI, and I think it happens with many issues, especially at the state level where there's so much of an advocacy approach. You kind of have to have that long view of how you're going to affect change. And so I'm curious, and maybe I'll start with you, Steve, on this one. Where do you take kind of lessons from your own personal life that's taught you about, having that long view and being committed over a series of days and months and weeks and even years to these bigger topics and issues? Anything in your personal life that's given you kind of guidance on that?
Well, I think, I'm a runner and a triathlete and a marathon runner. And so I've, had to train, and nothing happens overnight. We have to work at it and just kind of consistently do the training, and then ultimately results usually appear. And for this, we are in somewhat uncharted territory for our association, ever even beginning to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, we had to take baby steps first and really understand, some things that we can talk about here in a few minutes. But, over time, more and more information will come into the process that will lead to actions that the leadership in our association will ultimately decide to take or not, that they think will be in the best interest of our members as we try to represent them as accurately as possible, which was part of the study, is to make sure that we have accuracy and know who our members are. That's really it.
Yeah. Angela, what about for you, kind of having that long view? It's important as a state CEO, because, your processes are sometimes really extended with not having, and it's a little bit better in the environment that we have now where we're remote, but in general, like, you have to kind of have that long view. Anything in your personal life that's helped you to kind of have that perspective?
Absolutely. So personally, I grew up in Georgia, so a child of the South. And so learning my whole entire life about the history of the South has always been there in front of me. Then I spent about 8 years in Texas. So I was able to learn about the history of Texas, and a little bit different, but they also have a deep history. So being able to merge those two and just understanding just a little bit about history, and I love learning about that history, let me be able to take that and to be able to apply that just to understanding kind of just human nature, if you will. The other thing that I think helps me is coming from that local association and being able to work with members for over 20 years so closely and understanding those dynamics. It does help in my personal case, being able to understand the dynamics of what goes on throughout our state. Coming back to Tennessee is still the South. I love being back in the South. And I think it just helps me understand the dynamics of the history here, of such a deep, rich history of what is going on in our community.
How about you, Kenya? What anything personally that's kind of helped with you when you're dealing with, and obviously you're immersed in the DEI world now, and so you've got big challenges in front of you, but they all come there. Was that the big bang?
That was the bang.
We heard it.
We got it. Oh, that's well. It's entertaining for me. I'm sure for you, Angela, it's startling. But Kenya, anything that's kind of taught you to have that longer view in life from a personal standpoint that you apply now with dealing with DEI issues?
Sure. What's interesting is I think it's just been a lifelong journey, right? Being in my skin and living as a Black female. What's interesting is I think the conversation at a national level has changed significantly over the past year and a half because of the events that happened last summer. So I do think that diversity has always been a topic, but I think it's been more center stage, if you can say, for the past year and a half because of really where we are with the conversation in America, right? You know, we talk about DEI, it's really a concept of taking equity to the level of awareness. And that's what Angela touched on is awareness, right? So awareness and education, and to Steve's point as well, you know, awareness and education is what's really necessary for us to have this broad conversation, to feel comfortable having the conversation, and to acknowledge that it's necessary.
Anyone that's got questions throughout, feel free to throw those up in the chat. We'll take your questions that way. And of course, always encourage you just to share your own experiences and you know, have conversations in the chat. So go ahead and drop your comments in there as well, and we'll be sure to monitor that. Maybe to give a little bit of background, part of the reason that we're have both of you on here is that we've done recent work with both of your states, kind of different approaches to starting to begin to better understand diversity, equity, inclusion, and what the states might do. So Angela, I might bump back to you. Can you give us kind of a high level overview of you know, what you all did to engage and discuss and worked with Kenya on?
Sure. Prior to my arrival in Tennessee, our group had started a diversity and inclusion committee, and we're doing great things. Then a few years ago, we had some real interest where we did this program. We had a lot of attendance and really took the opportunity to do some roundtables and study what our members were saying. Kind of fast forwarding from that, we had a great class come out of it where Cher Powers then developed her class she's now going around teaching called The Umbrella Effect, doing a great job with that. So with that, with all of the attention that is in the news, our president last year, Hagen Stone, and our current president this year really wanted to take a hard look at what is going on in Tennessee. They put together a PAG with the focus of fair housing, diversity, inclusion, so that we could really take a 360 look at what's happening across our state. And so we wanted to bring in a facilitator, and immediately I thought of Kenya. Have so much respect for her. And so we brought T360 in with Kenya to facilitate that PAG. Kenya worked with us for several months, and we did a lot of things. We worked with that PAG to give them a open space, basically a safe space to have a lot of conversation. We did everything from looking at the history of Tennessee. And when I say history, it's not just the association, it was the history of understanding the history truly of Tennessee and how we got from point A to point B. We gave them a safe environment to talk about their own personal experiences, anything that they wanted to talk about, and including the association. And I will tell you that it really was a fantastic experience of really being able to have open dialogue about a lot of subjects. So we recently wrapped up the PAG, and the PAG report has just been concluded. So we're still in the phases, but it was a very worthwhile experience. It wasn't necessarily that Tennessee said, hey, we've got a problem. It was more of a, let's really take a look at where we are, where we've been, and do we have places we want to go so that we have an opportunity to really add some great things into the strat plan that we have coming up. That we're almost through with the strat plan that we have now. And let's take a look at what we might want to suggest that we look at for the future strat plan.
That's great. And I do want to talk about the integration of what's being learned through both of these exercises and how do you utilize it moving forward. But can you kind of anything that you might add from your perspective, having facilitated that you kind of took away from the work?
Sure. I just wanted to add that one, it's amazing the leadership that Angela and her executive team have had around this conversation. This PAG was really the best of the best when it came to Tennessee Realtors. We had a cross section of Realtors from every geographical area within Tennessee, so that was covered. We had members of the PAG that were experienced, new to the business, you name it. It was a very diverse group that really shared their time, their expertise, their personal experiences, and were committed to driving change. And to Angela's point, there's not a problem. It's what can we do to be better? What can we do to have more engaging conversations and really understand who our members are? And hats off to Angela and to the PAG for being open and vulnerable. And let me tell you, these conversations were not easy. They were very difficult conversations, and they were very personal for many on the PAG, but it was a great opportunity for us to understand the historical context of discrimination in housing as it relates to Tennessee, period, not necessarily the association, and how the association could be proactive in efforts through advocacy, awareness, and education. So it was a great opportunity to have a group of individuals really get together, understand the issues, to make recommendations to their leadership team.
Steve, for you, I know I did more of the direct work with you all, but you took a similar but different approach in terms of kind of getting that initial conversation going. And you wanted to start it, with more like kind of some baseline setting and getting grounded in the realities of what you saw. So we did some more survey work based approach.
Yeah, that was true. And I'll just back up just a little bit and say, it was 2 years ago that the Kentucky Realtors elected its very first African-American president of the association. And Lester Sanders, under his leadership, really helped us elevate this and place some importance that we hadn't in the past placed on it. And, we began these conversations, and ultimately a PAG was formed as well, to kind of look at this idea. And it ultimately led to a board retreat, which we were doing some strategic planning, but we also wanted to do a deeper dive and actually hired a different consultant for just diversity training, but also to facilitate our strategic plan and then incorporate a strategic initiative that was going to help us focus more on DEI. From that, then, we decided through the PAG's work, we wanted data. And that's kind of what led us to you. It was really an interesting process because I facilitate 2 calls with all the local association execs every month. And we're talking, and I'm sharing that, we think we're going to go about this work. And one of the local associations say, well, I'm talking to Clint right now, about the possibility of doing some work at our association. And one thing led to another, but I said, why do it? Why not let us do it as a state, and then do it in a way that we can get data that we can share with every local association so they have their own data to look at. And then they can also determine how to use it, how to program for it, using it, et cetera. So then, of course, we went out with T360 to begin the process of acquiring a lot of interesting data on our members that we didn't have before. And I will also add that the other reason that kind of drove us is that, we were trying to extract data from NAR's M1 platform, and some of the local associations had reported to us that they didn't think it really looked like their members, that what they were getting back didn't seem consistent with what they could say anecdotally we know about our own members. So this was an opportunity to kind of confirm or not whether or not the data was accurate that we were getting there and where some of the discrepancies lied. So that would help us a lot in that exercise. So that's where we went with it.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because we were hearing much of that around the country as well, whether it be, at state levels or local levels, folks were looking at their M1 data and saying, oh, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like it's, exorbitantly off, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it reflects who we know our members to be. And so through some of our work and some of the work that we did in not only comparing you against the NAR data, but against, just as Angela was saying, that the work was done in Tennessee. You can't just look at the association world, without understanding understanding the broader demographic concepts in the state. So we did some of that work as well, looking at that. But I think what we noted from the work is that we did find deviations in what the different ethnicity counts were between M1 data and then the membership data. But some of that is just in the difficulty of collecting the data to begin with, because there are different ways, and Kenya, you know this too from your work, there are different questions that can be asked. Do you allow for folks to respond to multiple ethnicities? Do you say that they're more than one as an answer? And all of this, especially when you start dealing with and you look at demographic data around how we gather data around those who are Hispanic, that caused, I think, some of the deviations that we were seeing because we did approach it a little bit, I think, in a broader context, whereas a lot of demographic data kind of forces folks into one bucket over the other. And so we found some deviations for sure. Nothing I think that was shocking, but I do think, Steve, in the end, we did note and feel a little bit better about some of the data that we were able to collect that way, where we could say, okay, well, you know, we're probably closer to this number than the number we were seeing in M1. So I think that's beneficial, or at least it was from our standpoint, the work that we were able to glean from it.
Yeah, it gave us a lot of, I guess, reassurance or assurance that the data, you know, we had really plowed the ground that we needed to make sure that we confirmed. And then again, you know, with anything like this becomes our benchmark. This is where we start. And we need to go back and do this again in a few years, maybe 3 years, and check it out and say, you know, what changes have occurred. Possibly even some of the initiatives that we are going to end up doing, whatever those are, hopefully to engage more folks, more diverse folks, et cetera. We might see numbers change. And you know, that might be a real interesting result of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Angela and Kenya, to throw this back to you, you know, kind of through your conversations, anything that were notable that kind of helped with to get more of that understanding and grounding, like, you know, I think Steve was saying they were trying to do with their work through what you did to just like get those baselines in place. Anything that were kind of key takeaways for you all?
To me, I think the key takeaway that I walked away with, and again, a lot of I was sharing before we came on that our PAG report has not gone to the leadership team yet. So there's some information that I'm not able to speak about just yet. But for me, sitting in my seat, the biggest takeaway, I believe, is sometimes I think you have members and even leadership that, you know, it's human nature. We all view things from our own lens. But I think when you can have a conversation with people who are able to share their experiences, where you're not in this judgment world, you're actually having people be able to say, I just experienced this even recently. And you're almost in an environment where you're just having a conversation. It's amazing what you can learn just by listening to members who are telling you, I just had this experience while showing a house, while talking to a seller, while walking in the door somewhere. And it's baffling that you're still hearing stories like this. So I think that is probably my one takeaway, is just listening to your members and giving them a safe environment to be able to talk. You will be amazed at what you hear, that where they're not put in a position where they're being judged or anything like that. It's just pure conversations.
Kenya, anything you would add, you know, in terms of that kind of key takeaway from the work that you did, again, especially in that baselining piece, you know, of establishing, here's what we do know. And again, not saying, oh, we're failing, and we saw the same thing in Kentucky through our survey results. Like there's no systematic or systemic, you know, failures here, but rather, again, getting some baselines to work on improvement was kind of the key from the survey work. Was similar on your side of the ledger from the work that you did?
Absolutely. You know, what's interesting is Angela brings up a very good point. Sometimes if something has not happened to you personally, you may not feel it really exists, right? So if that's not my experience, I may have a hard time understanding that it's yours. And in this group, we were able to dismantle that because there were true situations that happened to colleagues, to friends across the state that members of this PAG were just completely blown away by. And what's incredible is that that was a lesson of empathy, right? And I think that having empathy is so important when we are in this space, because again, just because it hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it doesn't exist or it can't happen, right? And I think that was a valuable lesson that everyone walked away from with this PAG. I think the other impactful piece to this was hearing what members thought across the state. From time to time, we think we know what our members are thinking or we know how they feel. You don't know until you ask them and until they tell you. And when they tell you, you can believe them. And there is no one answer that fits the entire state of Tennessee or Kentucky for that matter. You have members all across the board, from far left to far right. And I'm not talking about politics. I'm just talking about period, with different personalities, different experiences that shape who they are. And unfortunately, different perspectives, different thoughts in one region versus another region may be at a conflict or a crossroads from time to time. But what it helped us to really understand was that there's education, right, that needs to be done. Education is critical, and understanding how important and critical the state association is, because there is an opportunity for the state to help educate members right across the board. And we talk about meeting people where they are. That is so important because everyone is not in the same place. So having the ability to have empathy, to understand where members may or may not be coming from, and to understand that there are solutions and opportunities for us to be better based on what we understand our members think and know.
Yeah, we definitely saw deviations across Kentucky, but you think about this, especially if you look at it at a state scale, you have large metropolitan areas, you have small towns and communities, and then you've got outlying areas. And so their realities are very different, to your point, Kenya. And so getting to see those perspectives. So, one of the questions that we did ask in Steve's survey in Kentucky was, is it important that the association understand, the diversity and the demographics of their organization? And 73% said, yeah, very much so. But there were deviations in parts of the state. And then there were expressed concerns about, well, how are you going to apply it? There were folks that kind of, I think, took they were a little suspect, like, are you actually going to do something about this? And then there were others that were worried about it being too heavily relied upon. And, now we're going to set criteria or, quotas and those types of things. And so there's a real balance in understanding the deviations and then more importantly, how to apply them. And so, Steve, might come back to you on this. How do you see yourself now applying these? You said it started as kind of a strategic initiative. How do you take these baselines and apply them moving forward to help with your strategies and ways to improve upon what you've already been doing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think partially it starts with an awareness of who our members are and creating the awareness broadly, not just with our leadership, but, some of the fascinating nuggets that came out of this darn thing were like, who knew that Kentucky's realtor members spoke 27 different languages other than English? Seriously. We don't think of ourselves as a melting pot here in Kentucky, but I guess in some ways we are. Can we use that in some way? Is there a way to utilize some of these individuals who can do that? We've got, buyers and sellers that come from all these different backgrounds, races, whatever. And the fact is, some of these folks could be very helpful in that if we can identify who they are and then, help them help us. So the awareness piece is extremely important. You mentioned the fact that some of these questions again, were new to some of our folks and they were a little suspect. What was our agenda? Do we have a hidden agenda? Are we really trying to push something or a narrative, as often we hear in the media these days and all that stuff? And that was not it at all. Our motives were quite pure to really look at, let's just understand who is making up this whole group of members that we call Kentucky Realtors. So we, I don't know that we'll ever, be able to say that enough, but there'll be a group of folks that will be concerned about that. But, when you do ask for the first time ever about gender, sexual orientation, questions that are somewhat sensitive, you get a reaction from a certain group of people that are within that kind of a membership. So I would just say to all those listening that are considering doing this, go into it with your eyes wide open, because you may end up getting some of that back. And we looked at lots and lots of answers. In fact, our current president, as we got some of those back that really fired some shots at the association, he answered every single one of those individually, with a personal response to try to reassure, but to also say, what is our motive here? What are we attempting to do? And to try to say, we are really trying to make a better organization as a result of this. We cannot be as responsive to the members and deliver the product and service that they want without knowing who they are. So the next steps for us, Clint, is, we have a standing committee now that was, voted on and authorized by the board. And, this group is starting some programs. But one of the things is they now have taken their group and broken into a smaller group, a task force, to deep dive on the data and to say, what else is this telling us? Is it telling us anything else? And then from that, try to develop some recommendations to go to our board of directors and to be approved or not, to move things forward, programs, initiatives, whatever that react to the data. We've got sort of a 50,000 foot view now with all of this stuff. Now it's time to bring it way down, to 10,000 or 5,000 feet and figure out what is next, using this data, because it was quite a bit. It was quite a bit of data, that things that we hadn't thought about. But it was really, it was kind of fun to know. I mean, the age demographics and things like that, we probably kind of had a feel for, but things about their income, things about all of the specialties that they have and who, and how many in each of those were quite interesting to know. And then things that we really took away that we thought, oh, maybe we got to look at that a little more carefully, the big disparity in male versus female brokers. And we said, does that mean there's a barrier or some reason? So let's maybe ask more questions about, why that disparity exists. And then if there's a desire, perhaps that's an opportunity for us to begin, educational programs or whatever to try to help more females become brokers if they want to, So anyway, it's things like that.
Yeah, and those were really in those high-level advisement items that we shared back to you. The idea of getting really focused in on tailored communications because of the different way in which the message around this effort is received. Like you said, that advanced intelligence. Now that we've got general, how do we get more intelligent about the specifics and find those items that help us to then move towards what we would say would be systematic and systemic improvements? Because this is such a big issue. If you're not looking at things that really change things, over time, and get built into and ingrained in who we are and how we operate, you can get pulled in many, many different directions and spend a lot of time and energy without really strategically moving your organization forward. So I'm glad that it makes me feel good that some of the things we put in the report are being acted on. Angela, I know without not going into specifics because you haven't gotten that approved, but how do you envision what's been included in your work being applied, and making the organization become better strategically and building on those strengths that have been identified or addressing those weaknesses?
Sure. I go back to exactly what I said before. I think it all comes down to listening to your members, and basically what Kenya hit on as well. If we don't listen to our members, ultimately it's your members association. So piggybacking on what Steve's been saying, you got to identify who your members are and then ask them and listen to what it is their needs are. So when you do these types of PAG reports, it is so important to listen to the outcome and make sure that we're making changes if necessary to move in the direction to make sure you're including everyone that is a member. We can't keep operating our associations the way they've always been operated 50 years ago. You hold on to what works, but you make sure you adapt to what needs to be adapted to move the association along. And I think that's important even 100 years from now. As people look back, they're not going to do things the way we're doing it today. They're going to keep moving their association forward to be inclusive of the people that come later on. That's how we survive. And I think that's what's important, is that you keep listening to your members today, tomorrow, and in years to come, even when we're all long gone. It's just, that's how we survive. Once we stop listening to our members, then we're not needed any longer. And that's the bottom line, in my opinion.
Kenya, I might have you put on a different hat. For those that don't know, Kenya oversees and runs our real estate foundation that is focused on addressing these issues in our industry. And so, having done your work in Tennessee and seen that, day-to-day feedback and those ideas, how do you see applying that to the work that you hope to do and already have envisioned for the foundation? Some of those, like I said, those systemic issues. I know Steve mentioned, the differentiation between female leaders versus, we're a 2/3 female industry for the most part, and yet we look at our leadership and it doesn't reflect that. So I'm curious, what lessons are you taking to apply to help your organization, your efforts strategically and systematically?
Sure. What's interesting is hearing both Angela and Steve speak, it reminded me of something that we shared with the PAG. And that was, when we look at the term diversity, for some people that triggers right away ethnicity or race. But diversity is broad. There's several dimensions to diversity, including LGBTQ, gender, religion. There's so many other facets, but I think that we are so programmed into thinking it's race that sometimes that's where we stop thinking. And we've got to change that. And that was one great thing that we were able to do with our PAG, just to kind of step back a little bit, because it was a fair housing and diversity PAG. We brought in Lori Benner with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and she came on to speak to everyone about debunking some of the myths of fair housing. When you think about fair housing, sometimes you think, oh, it has to be a racial issue or an ethnicity issue. The number one complaint when it comes to fair housing is disability. Who would have known, right? So this is a constant learning process for all of us, and understanding what those core concerns may be as it relates to diversity, to fair housing, are really important. This goes back to education. I think it's going to take education and, as you said, Steve, awareness, right, for our members to truly understand what this is about. And I think someone had mentioned something about quotas or, giving people things. I think that was you, Clint. What's interesting is fear is driving a lot of this pushback from individuals that don't want to hear about DEI right now. Like, there is a growing fatigue in our industry with people saying, I don't want to hear about it. We've been talking about it since last year. We have the fair housing, legislation there. What more do we need to talk about? So, if we step away from using diversity and really talk about equity, because at the end of the day, we're just looking for equitable solutions for everyone, right? So I think, instead of being fatigued, let's find different ways to approach the conversation to keep this momentum going. But to address your question, Clint, about the foundation, Stefan Swanepoel and I started talking about this situation 3 years ago. What can we do to increase awareness and include, really help broaden diversity within our industry? And, a couple of years ago, we were fighting the iBuyers, different business models. Diversity was not top of mind as it related to our industry. So we both agreed, hey, this is not the time to really discuss any new initiatives. Then fast forward to last summer, and he said, this is the best time for us to really move this forward. And that's when the Real Estate Apprentice Foundation was formed. And this is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And our full focus is to ensure that we help underserved and underprivileged individuals. Keywords there: underserved and underprivileged, meaning anyone who has a desire to get into this industry, who may not have the financial wherewithal to get involved, but has the spirit and the desire to get involved. We have an opportunity to help them with grants, education grants, to obtain their license. And we have some heavy hitters in the industry right now that are behind us, including Tom Ferry, who's invested $1 million into the foundation. And the money's great, but the partnership is probably more important, because you all know barrier to entry is relatively low in this industry. You can get your license, but being able to maintain your license and understand how this business works is where we lose individuals. And that's everyone across the board. So we have a program set up to really help those individuals get in, have mentors and support. And it's a great opportunity for us to help improve diversity initiatives within the industry. I think Chris has put in the chat box the site to the Real Estate Apprentice website. So we'd love for you to take a look at it and see how you can get involved. And, we're all looking for solutions to make a change. And this is one of those areas that's real easy to get involved and to make a difference. But really what Angela and Steve are doing right now by taking the time and investing the hours to drive change is really critical. Listening to your members, understanding who your members are so you can meet them where they are is really important too.
You brought up a topic I was wanted to touch on before we concluded today, and that's the fatigue element. And I'm hearing more and more of it around the country, that there's certainly, I think in some instances, because there was such a rush for so many different levels of our 3 tiers to address the issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that there wasn't necessarily a lot of coordination. And so I think that bombardment for the everyday member felt, overly intense, because they were getting kind of these disparate messages and programs and services, and everybody well-meaning and well-intended. But I'm curious, and Angela, maybe I'll come back to you first on this. What role do you see the state, because you're kind of that nexus between the national and the local, what role do you see for the state in, trying to facilitate some organization of these efforts moving forward, providing resources back to the locals, but also ensuring that national efforts don't overreach or overstep and influence and impact local and state efforts that, many times have that more direct impact than a national one?
So I got 2 points on that. First of all, I would say that both Steve and I probably would say the same thing on this. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Steve. But I would say we're both here as resources to our local association. The National Association, of course, the AE committee recommended and NAR adopted the new core standards, where they added DEI into the core standards this year. So that caused some associations, that was great, they were already doing it, but there were some local associations that caused a little bit of, what are we going to do? So that is where I think the state can actually help to give them suggestions, give them some guidance or what have you, to help them have a little bit of ideas and suggestions on how they can implement new programs. In some opportunities, they can even partner with what the states might be doing. But definitely the states are there for a resource to be able to talk through with some of those associations to be able to help them. A lot of times it's amazing as you start talking to the local associations, what they are doing and what they're already doing. So I think just sometimes the idea may seem a little overwhelming, because like you said, there's so much discussion. It's kind of, where do we jump in? But once they start actually talking about it, members are really excited to be doing a lot of the programs that they're already doing, and members love that involvement. The other thing I would tell you is, when you start doing something like Steve and I are doing, and there's so many state associations out there that are probably doing far more than we're doing. I cannot stress enough the importance of using someone like Kenya or someone like Clint, because it is so much easier to have that facilitation from an outside source, and it makes the process go so much smoother. It makes your members more comfortable when they're able to talk to that consultant, that professional who is able to help facilitate that all the way through. And it makes us, as being involved in it, able to kind of listen to what's actually going on, and more than sitting there having to take the notes and do the research yourselves. So you're definitely going to be a big participant, but having that consultant participation with a subject like this is so important.
Thank you.
Thanks for the endorsement. Appreciate that.
You.
Checks in the mail, as they say. Steve, your thoughts kind of on that coordination and maybe even touching on the fatigue element, because it's, it was a really heavily focused on item and was raised up through NAR, and others, and as was noted by Angela, even changes in standards for the associations. How do you manage that? And in particular, again, what's that role of the local or the state to facilitate local, national, all those different aspects, and you, of course, getting your own initiatives in?
For sure. Well, I would start out by saying it's no secret that our communication is in tremendous competition with a whole lot of others. And, the messages that we're trying to get out and across and about the importance of what we try to do here, and on any other thing that we're trying to do with the association, you got to fight through a lot of noise to get there. And so it requires patience and repetition, but repetition only to a point before you end up angering members because you have come back to them too often. So, we talked about this with Clint, and literally how many times do we go out and ask, to try to retrieve data from folks that haven't responded, et cetera, et cetera. And, we did strategically place, our link to the study, the survey, so folks could find it if we didn't, get it directly to them through the direct communication. But that's really an important piece, and you have to remember that. But the thing about the coordination, if you look on the national level, you look at NAR. NAR can't help but look at a macro level because they're looking from coast to coast and border to border. And the differences that we all have are great. I mean, Angela and I share a border. We are regional partners. We work together very well, but I can tell you, Kentucky and Tennessee are different. They still are, and I can say within my own state, we've always said we're a state that's about 3 or 4 different states within our own border because of regional differences and the way, folks view the world from where they sit in this state. So I think we have to keep remembering that. And as Angela said, I mean, we kind of channel that back up to the national and remind them of, who we are, because we are so diverse, state to state, region to region, even within our own states. It's a very interesting proposition. So I think they want to hear what we're saying. I know that as we talked about the M1 data discrepancies potentially, they were all ears, and they said, hey, when you get this work done, can you share it with us so we can see where some of these issues lie so that we can address them ourselves. So I think that's a great partnership. They want to, and so your work helps their work, and all of us, perhaps get better as we go.
Thanks to Rebecca. She's shared a couple of resources in the chat. So if you didn't see those, a couple of great resources there. Kenya, maybe I'll start with you on this one, because you're seeing, when you're looking at a national landscape, as was just pointed out by Steve, there's differences down to the micro level and there's differences at the macro level. There was a lot of focus through news events, social movements, all the things occurring in 2020. How do we maintain this emphasis and focus and balance that against the fatigue moving forward? If there, aren't seemingly these huge social movements or we're so in the moment and, captured by the headlines. How do we as organized real estate, and, we haven't touched on, even the MLS's role in this, and I know you've done some work with MLS's, trying to get to the fair housing and equity issues, but how do we maintain the energy and focus alongside all of these other challenges that the industry is facing if, in fact, we're not seeing those headlines day over day? Any thoughts on that? And then I'll come back to Steve and Angela for your thoughts on that as well.
Sure. I think it's important for us to know this is not a moment, but it's a movement. And I think that this national conversation that has really come to focus over the past year is one that's not going away for a while. As you alluded to with the social justice and the racial justice movement, we're at a crossroads right now with making sure that, there are voices that are being heard that have never been heard before. And what's interesting is we've talked about education before, and I'm going to default back to Tennessee for just a moment as a reference. It was important for the PAC to understand the history of discrimination in Tennessee, to understand where we are today and some of the systemic issues that surrounded the issues that we are still having today, from redlining, right? From government involvement in covenants right now, right? Restrictive covenants that are there. Most of our major cities and states have racial covenants in place, restricting people of color from living in certain areas. So I'm saying all of this to say that there is a historical reference that needs to be kept in mind to understand why we're still having this conversation. And I think for people that may be fatigued, it's because they're not aware of the ramifications that people are still dealing with today in certain neighborhoods. You can ride through a neighborhood and think, wow, why are people living this way? Well, there's a reason behind it. And if we go back and look at, redlining in certain neighborhoods, that's an example of what some of these neighborhoods still look like today. So the impact of systemic racism is still alive today. And I do think that there is a voice across the country, and this voice includes our members on a broad level, to dismantle some of the things that are in place. We've talked about advocacy efforts, and things that can happen state by state to help with these issues. And I think that, there's a growing fatigue because we're also in the middle of a pandemic, right? So, add the pandemic to the mix, and that's just another layer. But I do think that this is a conversation that isn't going away. And I think that for those who have fatigue, if they could take a little bit of time to be empathetic and to understand the history behind the movement, it would really help make a difference.
Steve, Angela, thoughts on kind of maintaining that momentum, and building off what's, was started in this past year and making sure that it's maintained going forward. And I don't know who wants to jump in on that one.
Well, I can just really briefly say to you that, our leadership has considered it important enough to put into the strategic plan, and that we have real goals that are, we can measure, how many folks are taking advantage of some of the programs that are offered through NAR that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that we are encouraging that on a regular basis, that folks continue to be educated, and we incorporate that into the education offerings that we have as an association to our members, so that it is constantly in front of them. So, over time, it becomes part of what we are and what we do. This, I would say, is relatively new. We have not, I've only been at this association 5 years, but, when I first came here, it wasn't part of us. And so, yes, 2020 probably had a lot to do with that. But I think people have come to realize that that's an important component that we need to keep incorporated into what we're doing. So that's what I would say.
Angela?
What I would say is action items like what Steve listed for associations. I think those are all important, but I think what's just as important is for leaders like us and any leaders coming forward, anybody who watches the video. I think it's a commitment that we have to personally make, because when we make the decision that it's important to me or it's important to you, then we keep it on the forefront. And I think that's where it really matters, is that we keep it in front of people. And that we make that commitment to always make sure that we're including people. And like Kenya kept bringing up many times in the PAG, that I think she said that Women's Council had this great way of doing things. And they always said things like, the task is to ask. And she quoted things that they have preached forever, but it needs to be applied in associations to everybody, that part of the responsibility is to ask people to the table, and then the other part of the responsibility is for those people to actually come. But that's our responsibility too, is to make sure that everybody feels included, and that we're moving things to make sure that those things are happening and keeping the conversation going. So I think in addition to, making sure things are in the strat plan and that type of stuff, it's important that we walk the walk and talk the talk.
Yeah. I mean, so much of culture for me emanates from the strategy, right? And then it gets into your processes and becomes a part of what your outcomes are. And then, it's a belief and it's a part of who you are and how you operate. But beyond that, if you want to talk about practicum, I think, Steve, one of the things that was really intriguing to me, and this is an industry-wide challenge, whether it's, associations, brokerages, or what, is in the age differential. And of course, we have a significant demographic shift happening in this country. And we, when we're talking about it, probably before some of this other DEI stuff did move a little bit of the focus. But from a business practicum, if you're a membership organization and you have a significant demographic shift in age, And folks that are younger, and what we saw in your survey, Steve, was folks who are younger are overly dependent on being buyer's reps. So they're not listing. And so, we talk about this idea of folks making it through those first couple of years. Well, it's because the Rolodex that, especially if you're younger, you bring with you tend to be more in that buyer's category than the seller's category. So I think there's some business practicum to sticking to this as well, especially as it applies to age, because we've got to transition and look at how do we welcome in new folks. And of course, this is a second, third career industry. So we'll typically see a higher end in terms of age coming in, but 55-year-old 2 years ago is not a 55-year-old in 10 years, and how that looks. So I think there's some real practicum when you're a membership driven entity to know that this is how you need to shift and look at it and focus anew. So to me, that's a way to maintain leadership interest as well, because it's a true funding mechanism to better understand. I don't know if you all had any thoughts on that.
I would just say to your very point, Clint, in the data that we got, as you spoke very early in this this conversation about the demographics in terms of the value people placed on actually us even doing this work, and then getting involved in DEI, and the very strong data that we got back that said that whole younger cohort valued it at such a high level. Not that the people at the oldest cohorts didn't value it, they still did, but it was very, very dominant down low. Well, that's the future of the organization, right? And for us to continue to exist and perpetuate, we better be addressing what these folks feel, are their interests, and that will actually create more engagement, right? Because that's one of the ideas here too. We want more engagement. And so listening to the fact that this young group says, hey, this is real important stuff, folks, and we want you involved in this, ought to be enough to say, okay, we're going to continue to pursue it.
That's interesting that you bring up generational differences, because across the board, and so I'm not speaking specifically about Tennessee, but across the country, we're noticing that Gen Z, Gen X, and millennials, social change is at the top of their list, right? And if there are companies or organizations that don't have that as a priority, they're not interested in being involved. So it's interesting how different generations have different ways of thinking when it comes to this, but you're absolutely right. It's that next generation of realtors that we should be concerned about. And their concerns may be a little bit different than our boomer agent concerns. Doesn't mean theirs aren't right or theirs are wrong, but it's finding that equal medium, right, for them. But I will say that Gen X, Gen Y, and millennials, and some of us, Gen Xers, are still very concerned about social issues, and those are more important. Those are at the top of the list when it comes to making decisions with brokerages, right? So it's interesting that we're looking at this at a state association level, but even when they make decisions to find a brokerage, that's something that's important to them as well.
Well, and the ethnicity strata in the younger cohorts is becoming closer and closer. We're becoming more diversified in those younger age groupings. And so you couple the youth with being more predominantly buyer rep. What we also saw in the data in Kentucky is those who are ethnic from a different ethnicity other than Caucasian were also highly dependent on those buyer representatives. So now you got this compounding factor. And so as they become more and more diverse and they move through the system, you've got these other, as you talked about, Kenya, fair housing elements that influence one's ability to be successful in the industry. These are important practicum-based things for, again, whether it be association, MLSs, or brokerages to understand. And sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there, Angela. I don't know if you've got something to add on that. But I think this is the complexity of this issue as we start to focus in on younger generations that are more diversified.
Yeah, I think NAR is even starting to pay attention to this. They have started the new mentoring program that is in pilot now. I know Memphis is participating with that, but it may be worth paying attention to. And as they expand that program, definitely take a look at for other cities to get involved with. I think it is a prime opportunity for younger generations to get involved and locals to encourage that.
Few minutes left here. Any kind of final words of wisdom, anything you want to leave as a parting message for those who have tuned in today and that'll be seeing this in the recording format? And maybe I'll start with you, Kenya, and work my way back through Steve and then to Angela.
Sure. I think it's real important for us when we have these conversations to have an open heart and an open mind. We've talked about empathy, understanding, education and awareness. All of those are very important pieces to this puzzle. Again, this is not just a moment. I think it's a movement. And I think that this is definitely going to be something at the forefront. It's no longer going to be a separate, here's our DEI strategy and here's our strat plan. We're going to weave these together to make them important, to make this a very important piece of the overall plan. So I think just having an open mind, an open heart, truly important, and to understand where different individuals are coming from. And, you know, we talk about having a seat at the table. It's great to have a seat at the table. Let's make people feel welcome when they're invited and understand that there is definitely some richness in having a different voice, different opinion at the table.
Yeah, I always emphasize the fact that innovation, those who are thoughtful and apply innovation strategies, one of the primary elements is diversification of thought. And so if we don't have that and we complain about lack of innovation in the association MLS and even the real estate industry as a whole, here's one practicum that we can apply now to help facilitate and encourage greater innovation. So yeah, I think that's a great point. Steve, kind of closing comments or thoughts from you?
You know, I think by human nature, you know, we all want to know what's in it for me, you know, and so when we're communicating on this issue and the data that we've got and all of the stuff and why we're doing this, I think it's important to always discuss the value of it in the messaging that we're creating for our members. And, you know, very broadly speaking, for any association, it's to build a better association. I mean, it's literally to be a more responsive association. If we understand the members we have and the needs they have, obviously we should be more responsive and create things for them that they really want to be part of. And that will lead to that greater engagement that we all want. So, you know, it's a value proposition, right? So that's kind of that was kind of a takeaway, I thought, for me as I listened to some of the stuff that was said.
Awesome. Angela?
What I would say in closing is that I go back to what I said earlier. It is so important to learn from your members. We do what we do because we care about our members, and our world is changing so fast. Our association world is changing so fast. It is so important that you take the pulse of your membership and give them opportunities along the way to express how they're feeling, what's going on in their world, and what they think about the association and their involvement. It is the only way you're going to get them to be involved and stay involved and continue to lead the association. So give them that environment, listen to them, and then implement some of their thoughts along the way, and do that what groups you talk to. Just listen.
Well, the associations are predicated on the idea of collaboration, and I know Ann had asked earlier in the chat section, can we reach out to you? Can they talk to you? I assume you both are comfortable and happy to talk with anyone that's looking at these types of initiatives, whether it be at the state or local levels.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for your time. Thanks for sharing your kind of insights and experiences, and certainly appreciate you having invited both Kenya and I in to work with you all and learn together. And I think that we're all learning about this piece together. And if you don't go in with that open mind, I think, as Kenya said multiple times, you're going to miss out on real opportunities to move our organizations forward collectively. So thank you all for your time today. Thanks to everybody that tuned in, and we will be sending the replay out. If you want to share that, we're certainly happy to provide that back to you. So other than that, I think we're done here. If you want to go out, and is it Wednesday? I don't even know. I feel like it's Friday already, and I think it's only Wednesday, right? Can someone confirm yes or no? Okay. All right. Yeah. So go enjoy your Wednesday, not your Friday yet. And then
right.
We will catch you next month here on Organized Real Estate. Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.